Hello, Ricky here from Design Plus Code, and in this tutorial we're going to be introduced to Framer, a code-based design and prototyping tool. We're going to explore the core concepts that makes Framer a powerful prototyping option for designers and developers, and we're going to replicate one of the transitions found in the Design Plus Code app. When you open Framer for the first time, you will see that it has a very familiar UI, very similar to many of the design apps that we are used to. By default, your new project will open on design mode, but you can work independently or combined with code mode. Framer's Design tab can be broken down into four main parts. 1. The sidebar. Here we have tools for inserting artboards, rectangles, ovals, text, zooming the canvas, and at the bottom, a built-in icon panel. Like most other design tools, Framer also has a layer panel. However, there are some key differences. We'll go into these in more detail later so you can understand how layers work in Framer. You can use the canvas to create artboards for a wide variety of phones, tablets, watches, desktops, and even TVs. Properties panel. When you select a layer on an artboard, a list of available properties for styling and layout appears. The Code tab can be divided into 5 parts. The first, sidebar. The sidebar is very similar like in design mode. You have different tools to quickly animate your layers. Plus, you can import your designs from other apps hitting the import button. You can also quickly access to the Framer documentation or inspect your code. Layer panel. It shows you all your layers similar like in design mode. Also, if you right-click any of your layers, you can immediately add an animation, a state, or an event. If you hover over any of your layers on the layer panel, you can easily identify it on the preview window. Code editor area. It is really easy to start coding on Framer. It has a very appealing and helpful syntax highlighting. The bottom of the editor area is reserved to show you the errors that you have in your code. And something that we love is the smart autocomplete feature that Framer has. Preview window. It is a canvas with the render prototype, which gives you real-time visual feedback. From the top of the navigation bar, you can select different type of devices and also you can detach preview window. The properties panel. You can access it by clicking on the edit icon. On that panel, you will see the different properties of your animations, state, or event. If you modify a layer from the preview window, you will see the changes in 2 more places, on the properties panel and in the code editor area. AutoCode keeps up the code with your visual modifications all the time. Layers in Framer are very similar to layers in any other design tool. But there are a few small differences that set them apart. We're all used to the concept of grouping in Sketch, where you select 2 or more layers and create a group with those layers. Technically, there are no groups in Framer. Layers nest instead, like divs on a website. Take a look at the artboard called Page 1. It has a number of child layers. iOS Guide is at the top of this tree and itself contains some child layers. iOS Guide Image contains the heading and body text. These text layers are nested, and although they appear below the iOS Guide image in the layer panel, they actually sit above the image and are still visible on the canvas. Targets. We need to activate the layers in our design, so we can use them on code mode. The layers activated in design mode are highlighted. To target a layer, we just need to click on the small icon next to it. One of Framer's power feature is responsiveness by default. Depending on where and how you place layers on artboards, Framer will always try to work out how you want it to respond to changes in screen size. So for example, if you place a layer snapped to the right side of the screen when the screen resizes, the layer will stay snapped to that position. The layout system obviously can't predict every situation. As your design gets more complex, it's worth heading over to the layout panel to make modifications yourself. What's really awesome about Framer's layout tool is that it gives you a preview of how your layer will behave with currently selected settings. Code Essentials. The core concepts of prototyping in Framer can be broken into 4 parts. They're simple, but mastering them will take your prototyping to the next level. The first is layers. Layers in Framer are not unlike the layers you'll find in Sketch. When you create a layer, you can style it and add images, texts, and videos. Layers can be parented to other layers and animated too. They're the building blocks of Framer. Animation. Animation is what brings your layers to life. You can animate layer properties like background color, height, width, size, opacity, border radius, etc. States are stored sets of layer properties. You can create multiple states of pretty much anything in Framer and switch or animate between them. Events are used to detect and respond to user input or interactions like taps, double taps, drags, and more. Normally, events trigger animations or state changes. For this exercise, we will work only on the Code tab. I already added the designs on the Design tab, and I targeted all the different layers that we will use. What we will do in the exercise is to replicate the animation when we tap into one of the section cards. This card will unfold, showing us the contents of the section, and then we will animate when we tap on the close button and the card folds again. Most of the first part of our code will focus to set up all our different elements into the artboard, yet in parts. Transition 1, open event, and transition 2, close event. We will work on the unfold and fold animations respectively. Before we begin, download the project files on the link we have provided to follow this tutorial. You should open the design code-chapter-new.framer file to get started. But if at any time you feel the need to see the solution, that's also included in the download. Before we get into the fun stuff, we're going to do a bit of setup to our exercise. First, we're going to define the spring curve for the animations that we'll use in our example. Then we will write some text that will show up at the moment when the card will unfold. You will see it again almost at the end of the exercise. And finally, we will set the default state for the play and close buttons. We will move the close button out of the canvas. Then we will scale down the play button to 0.5. And give an opacity of 0. Then we will select all this code, right-click and select Fold. This is where Framer's Code Fold feature really shines. This will create a new section for this code. It's good to keep this away from our main code to keep it clean. To introduce paging to our cards, we need to use a page component. We will make it a child layer of page view, which is the layer from the chapter's artboard in design it should be parented to. Then the Y position is set. As the page component now has page view as a parent layer, any position values it's given is in relation to its parent. When we set its Y position to 60, what we're actually doing is setting it to 60 pixels down from the top of the page view layer. To offset this positioning, we've set our page component's height with a simple calculation. This is a quick way to set the value of a property on a layer, if you don't want to set it manually, that is. As this page component should only scroll horizontally, we've set scroll vertical to false. Finally, setting the content inset gives our pages some margin on the left and right. Feel free to play around with some of these values to see how they change the layout. You now have the page component set up, but it needs some content. Adding content is extremely easy. We just need to add pages to our page component. The code inside the brackets is the layer, or in this case, the artboard we want as the content of that page. Setting states. It's important that some states are set up for elements so we can animate between them. Let's set up the play button. Here we have two states, show and hide. Think of states as a way of storing properties we can toggle between. We've also added animation options so we get a nice transition between the two states controlled by the spring curve we've created in setup. Let's do the same with the close button. Next, we'll store some default properties from the iOS guide layer we'll need to use later. Just like what we've done with our play and close buttons above, we'll set up states for the iOS guide and the image inside it. The final bit of setting up before we begin coding the transition is to add some extra content to the iOS guide, as seen in the example. Framer's text layer makes this very easy. Transition 1, Open Event. We want the transition to begin when the iOS guide is tapped. To do this, we're going to use the OnTap event. iOS guide.onTap. When this happens, we want to remove it from the page component and parent it to the chapter screen. This is so when it expands, it isn't clipped by its parent layer and appears above everything else. By default, parenting the iOS guide layer to a new layer on an event would change its position on screen. But we want the transition to start from the same position it was when inside the page component. To do this, we're going to use one of the properties from iOS guide we stored earlier, called Screen Frame. In Framer, this property gets the exact position and size of an element on screen. For now, we will use the word this. Next, let's change the appearance of the status bar and place the iOS guide under it. This is obviously optional, but when designing for iOS, it's good practice to make use of both light and dark versions of the status bar, so there's always good contrast when changing the context it's displayed in. We're going to use the states we set up earlier and animate the iOS guide and the iOS guide image to these states. To animate to different states, we've used the .animate method and passed in the name of the states we want to animate to. The state name should always be a string, so it should be enclosed in quotation marks. We should now have a transition between screens. For the moment, there's no way to reverse this though. We need to show the close and play buttons. To do this, we'll use .animate again and pass in the state show for each to animate to these states. We'll also place them above the iOS guide to make sure they're visible. We need a way to close the article screen and return back to chapters. To do this, we're going to add an OnTap event to the close button and reverse our components back to their initial states. The final thing we need to do is put the iOS guide back into the page component when the close animation ends. To do this, we're going to listen for when the iOS current state name is close. This is because we're going to dot on animation end to check for when it stops animating. But we don't want to put it back into the page component when the opening animation ends. We used an if statement to check if the iOS guide's current state name is close. And if it is, do something. In this case, putting it back into page 1 in the page component and setting its X and Y properties back to their initial values inside page 1, which we've stored in origX and origY earlier in the prototype. Now we can tap on the card and we can see how it opens, and then we can tap on the close button and see how it closes. If we want, we can add an iPhone frame to our prototype as well.